Hey everyone, I have an interesting little study to tell you about today. Researchers at Stony Brook University in New York State sampled skulls from people who were buried in two ancient European grave sites. Each grave site, one in Hungary and another in Italy, date back to the 6th century, during the middle of the European migration period where Germanic barbarians were migrating southwards and interacting with the Roman Empire. These encounters were often violent and contributed to the decline and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire, and thus influenced the developing geopolitical landscape of Europe as a whole. From the grave sites, they collected skull and bone samples and extracted the DNA, so as to study the genetic origin and the relation to the other bodies. Both sites, the researchers say, quote, have been previously associated with the Longobards, a barbarian people that ruled large parts of Italy for over 200 years after invading from Pannonia in 568 CE, unquote. The researchers described the grave sites, or the cemeteries, as, quote, primarily organized around one large pedigree, suggesting that biological relationships played an important role in these early medieval societies, unquote. But, and this is really interesting, they also found, quote, genetic structure in each cemetery involving at least two groups with different ancestry that were very distinct in terms of their funerary customs, unquote. This is really interesting because it gives us clues as to the structure and the hierarchy of the societies that were here at the time. The genetic data suggests that the two ancestral groups were Northern and Southern Europeans. The northern lineages were Germanic peoples who were migrating southward, while the southern lineages were of northern Italian peoples and others in southern Europe who were in the way, so to speak, of the migrating German tribes. The hierarchy of these tribes was clearly presented in the graves, in the arrangement and the dressing of the bodies. Some of the women were adorned with jewelry, like necklaces, and some of the men were dressed with armors and weapons. Those that had these decorations on their corpse were of Germanic descent, while those buried in a more humble fashion were of Southern European descent. So you kind of get an insight here into who was in charge, as to who was invading who. In the Hungarian site, called Zolad, the cemetery arrangement had a core group of 18 male bodies, surrounded by a half-ring of 11 female bodies, and most of them were in, quote, elaborate graves with ledge walls and wooden chambers all in the same orientation, furnished with numerous artifacts, such as beads, pottery, swords, and shields, unquote. There was another 16 bodies that surrounded them, with a little less ornamentation. 7 of these bodies had no grave goods at all, with randomly oriented graves. Now, the researchers point out that this doesn't necessarily mean that these were of lower status, just that these people had a different social group. This nuance is important to understand, but my gut feeling when looking at this data is that these people were indeed of a lower social status. I mean, it seems rather odd that they wouldn't have adorned the graves of their dead loved ones. You would think that that would be a right that everyone would have access to if these groups were, somewhat equal. But the fact that one group has ornamentation and another group doesn't makes me think that the power dynamics of this society kind of, the invaded Southern Europeans were probably taken advantage of, and they weren't given the dignity of being allowed to ornament the graves of their dead kin. However the society was organized, it wasn't a community that lasted very long. It actually didn't last very long at all. I mean, the evidence of this Zolad community suggests that people lived here for only around 20 to 30 years before migrating onwards, so less than one generation coming to maturity. All of these bodies were, quote, organized around a 3-generation kindred with 10 members, all but one of which were predominantly Central/Northern ancestry. Members of this kindred stand out in relation to others for a number of reasons. 1. Access to a diet higher in animal protein. 2. Graves occupying a prominent position in the cemetery. 3. The presence of the oldest individual in the cemetery. And 4. The individual with the deepest grave and the only one buried with a horse, Thuringian-type pottery, and a scale with weights and coins, unquote. Now, the genetic data of the female bodies shows that relatively few of them were from the same northern areas as the core group of males, which would suggest that this core migrating group was picking up women along the way, and either forcefully taking them with them, or the women were choosing of their own volition to migrate with them. Now, the other grave site in northern Italy, called Collegno, was really similar to the one in Hungary, but it represented a community that was much longer lasting than the Zolad community. The Collegno grave sites also showed a core group of northern/central ancestry that was surrounded by increasingly distant relatives and, at the very edges, genetically unrelated individuals. The bodies of the people of southern ancestry show signs of having a diet with less animal protein, and graves with little to no ornamentation. The authors say, again, that it's tempting to infer a scenario of barbarian families dominating the resident populations. And it is. I think that's really tempting. I kind of think that that conclusion is obvious, but it's okay that the authors are being cautious. Anthropology tends to be pretty cautious in this manner. Although me, as a big, clumsy biologist coming in and trampling all over the anthropological data, I would say that the evidence of these southern Europeans having not just unornamented graves, but also a diet that was lower in protein, which would suggest that they were given, the scraps and the lower quality food, I think that this is pretty strongly indicative of a more oppressive social hierarchy than the authors of the paper are kind of letting on. So essentially, this data depicts the migration of what is most likely a Longobarд barbarian group, which migrated from more northern regions in Europe down into the lands of the Roman Empire. It's tempting, as the authors say, to conclude that these barbarian families ruled over the subjugated southern Europeans in life, but we can definitely say that they prioritized their family members in death, with elaborate grave ornamentation that the southern European peoples either just didn't have or were denied. This data is really interesting because it shows that invading barbarian groups were not necessarily genetically homogeneous, which was surprising to researchers. They didn't expect to have so much genetic mixing, including several individuals outside the main northern lineage who seemed to enjoy nicely placed graves with ample ornamentation. This also implies a more complex social organization than was expected, and it also implies perhaps a more nuanced social organization than just oppressor-oppressee. Now, while all of this stuff is really cool, it's only a small piece of the huge puzzle that is gene flow across Europe over the last few millennia. The researchers comment on the limitations of their study, saying, and I quote, "Unfortunately, grave goods represent a limited and highly curated portion of material culture, and with little other archaeological data available, fundamental questions about barbarian social organization and migration remain unanswered and vigorously debated." Unquote.